Wyoming Territory, July 1878. The wind carried dust and heat across the stretch of dry land where the Red Rock Ranch sat, worn but holding. It was near dusk when Naomi Ralston dipped her hands into the wash basin behind the bunkhouse, scrubbing blood from a torn shirt sleeve that was not hers. She had not meant to stay this long only until her debt was paid, but the weeks had turned to months, and the weight of what she owed pressed heavy on her every breath. Her hands, once soft and careful, were calloused now. She worked from sun-up to well after dark, hauling water, cleaning up after the ranch hands, cooking, mending, and keeping the books for a man who had taken her in when she showed up with nothing but a stitched wound under her ribs and a promise to work off every dollar she owed. Naomi had not spoken of how she got the wound. She had not spoken much at all. She was 23, alone, and the debt was not even hers. The man she had trusted with her father's land had lost it in a crooked game of faro. When he left in the night, he left her name behind to settle it. A cruel piece of paper said she owed $200 to Red Rock Ranch, and the rancher, Tom Edgerton, had looked her straight in the eye and said, "You can work it off. I do not take charity, and I do not forget what folks owe." So she said yes. That was 4 months ago. The bunkhouse door creaked behind her. Naomi turned, straightening up, wiping her hands dry on her skirt. It was just Tom, checking on the ledger she had been working on. "You got the figures for the cattle sale ready?" he asked. She handed him the paper, her face unreadable. "Yes, sir." He grunted and walked back inside. Naomi turned back to the basin. The sun was nearly gone now, sinking behind the ridge of the hills. She stood a moment longer, watching the light fade. Then she picked up the empty water bucket and started toward the well. The sound of hooves came from the east trail. She paused, peering into the distance. A lone rider, her stomach tensed. Travelers rarely came down this way unless they were lost or looking for something they had no business finding. The horse slowed as it neared the ranch yard. The man in the saddle was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a trail coat dusted in red earth. His hat was pulled low, but Naomi could see the sharp line of his jaw and the dark stubble across his cheeks. He swung down from the saddle in one fluid motion and looked around until his eyes found hers. "Evening," he said, voice low and steady. She nodded once. "Evening." He stepped closer, hat in his hand now. His eyes were steady and dark, but not cold. "Name's Callum Mercer. I was told Naomi Ralston was working here." She froze, fingers tightening around the bucket handle. "Who told you that?" "A woman down in Laramie. Said she passed through here weeks ago. You helped her when no one else would." Naomi's jaw clenched. She remembered the woman beaten up bad, running from someone. Naomi had cleaned her cuts and given her food, never asked questions. "Why are you looking for me?" she asked. "Because I owe you," he said, and his voice was quieter now. "That woman was my sister." Naomi stared at him. The wind blew across the yard, tugging hair loose from her braid. Callum looked around the ranch, then back at her. "She told me what you did. Said you were in trouble, said you should not be working like this." "I agreed to work until my debt was gone," Naomi said, her voice flat. "That is the deal." Callum stepped closer. "Then I will pay it." Her brows pulled together. "What? I have money. I will settle your debt." "You can leave with me." Naomi's breath caught. She looked past him toward the bunkhouse, the corral, the hills beyond. "Why would you do that?" "Because you helped my sister when you had no reason to. And because no one should be trapped somewhere they do not want to be." She shook her head slowly. "You do not even know me." "I know enough," he said. "I know you worked to help someone else. I know you kept going when most would have run. And I know this place does not deserve you." She looked down at the bucket in her hand. Her knuckles were white. "You owe me nothing now," he said. Something in her broke, not loudly, not with tears, just a quiet, hollow crack inside her chest. I do not even know where I would go." Callum stepped closer. "Then come with me." She looked up at him. His eyes were steady, not demanding, not pitying, just real. "I want to," she said, her voice barely there. "But I do not know if I can." He reached out slowly, giving her time, and brushed her knuckles with his fingertips. "You can." That night she packed what little she had: a worn shawl, her mother's locket, 2 folded letters she had never mailed, and 1 pale blue ribbon she had never worn. Tom signed the paper without a word when Callum laid the money on the desk. They rode out at dawn. Naomi sat behind him on the saddle, arms around his waist, heart pounding in her chest. She did not know what waited beyond the ridge. But for the first time in months, she felt something like air in her lungs again. He did not talk much. Neither did she. But when he reached back and gently took her hand in his, she held on tight, and she did not let go. They stopped 2 days south of the ranch, where the land began to roll gently, and the air smelled of pine and creek rock. Callum led the horse into a clearing beside a stream, tying the reins to a twisted cottonwood. Naomi dismounted without his help, stiff from the saddle but quiet in her movements. She knelt by the water, cupping her hands to drink. When she looked up, Callum was unrolling his bedroll a few paces away, glancing at her only once, and then letting her be. They hadn't spoken much since leaving Red Rock. The silence hadn't been heavy, just full. Like both of them were waiting to see what shape the days would take without the weight they'd been carrying. Naomi stood and brushed the dust from her skirt. "You always travel this light." Callum poured beans into a small pot. "I don't make a habit of staying long." She lowered herself onto a flat stone near the fire ring. "That by choice?" His eyes flicked up. "Sometimes." The fire caught with a few strikes of flint. Naomi watched the flames twist up, catching on dry kindling. She pulled her shawl tighter as the evening cooled. "You're not what I expected," she said after a while. "What did you expect?" "Someone quicker to take credit." He stirred the pot once and set it near the coals. "I didn't come for thanks." "Then why did you come?" Callum didn't answer right away. The wind moved through the grass, brushing against her ankles like a question. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "I've been trying to put something right, a long while now." Naomi folded her hands in her lap. "You think helping me does that?" "I think it's a start." She didn't press. The quiet between them didn't feel like distance, it felt like space being made. After they ate, he offered her the blanket he wasn't using. She took it and lay down just outside the ring of firelight. Callum stayed up, sharpening his knife with slow, even strokes. In the dark, Naomi stared up at the stars. She hadn't seen them this clear in months. There'd always been smoke or lanterns or roofs in the way. Now they stretched above her, wide and sharp, and she felt small in the way that wasn't frightening, just honest. "Where are we going?" she asked without turning. "That depends," Callum said. "On what?" "On where you want to be." She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know anymore." "We'll ride till you do." The next morning the clouds hung low and thick. They rode west, following the creek until it split into 2 narrow forks. Naomi's hair had come loose from its braid, but she didn't pause to fix it. Her shoulders had stopped aching from the saddle. She was getting used to the rhythm of the ride, the quiet beside Callum, the way he pointed out deer tracks or low-hanging storm signs without expecting anything back. That afternoon, they came across an old way station, long abandoned, its roof half fallen and door swinging loose. Callum rode ahead and checked it before waving her in. Inside, dust lay thick over the floorboards, but the hearth was sound, and part of the roof still held. Naomi set her bundle down and glanced at the sagging rafters. "It'll keep the rain off for a night," Callum said, setting his rifle within reach. She nodded. "You ever think about settling somewhere?" He leaned against the wall near the door. "Used to." "What changed?" didn't have anyone to stay for. Naomi looked over at him. There was no shift in his face, no invitation, just a steady truth laid bare. She turned back to the hearth and began stacking kindling. "Maybe you will." Callum didn't answer. That evening they shared the last of the dried peaches and sat near the fire. Naomi pulled her knees up and rested her chin on them. Callum sat beside her, his coat draped over both their shoulders. Their arms touched, but neither moved. "When this is over," she said, "when I figure out where I'm going." "What'll you do?" "That depends," he said. "On what?" He looked at her, his voice low. "On whether or not you want company." She didn't look away. "I might." Callum's hand brushed hers, light and careful. She didn't pull away. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, but inside, the fire burned steady. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Naomi felt something inside her settle, not finished, but starting to heal. By the 5th day, the last signs of trail dust had settled into Naomi's clothes, and her hands had stopped tightening at the reins like she expected them to pull her back. The trail had widened into country less raw, where ryegrass moved in long waves and cottonwoods stood in quiet thickets beside the river. They passed no towns, just the occasional fence line or smoke in the distance. That morning Callum had turned their course slightly north, and by late afternoon a ridgeline came into view, low and steady, with scattered cabins tucked along its base. He slowed his horse. "There's a man lives out here, name's Ellis, keeps bees and minds his own business. I worked under him near 20 years back." Naomi shifted in the saddle, her voice dry from the wind. "You think he'll take us in?" Callum glanced over. "He'll take you in. I'll sleep in the barn if it comes to that." They rode the last stretch in silence. The cabin came into focus at the end of a narrow track, smoke curling from the chimney. A wheelbarrow tipped on its side beside a row of empty hives. A man in his 60s stepped out from the shed, wiping his hands on his trousers. He squinted at them, then shaded his eyes. "Well, I'll be," he said, voice rough as gravel. "Callum Mercer, thought you were dead or halfway there." Callum dismounted, gave a brief nod. "Still breathing." The man's eyes flicked to Naomi. "And who's this?" She swung down, her legs aching from the ride, and stood straight. "Naomi Ralston." Ellis studied her a moment, then gave a grunt. "You hungry?" A meal was waiting before Naomi could think to refuse. Inside, the cabin smelled of beeswax and tobacco. She sat at the table while Callum fetched water. Ellis slid a plate toward her cornbread, salt pork, pickled beans, and poured coffee into a tin cup with a steady hand. "You from Colorado?" he asked, not unkindly. She took a sip, nodded. "North of Fort Collins. Lot of folks headed east from there lately." "I didn't," she said. He didn't ask why. Later, when the sun dipped behind the ridge, Ellis stepped out to tend the hives. Naomi sat on the porch, her knees pulled up, watching the dusk settle over the fields. Callum stood a few feet away, arms crossed, hat tipped back. "You trust him," she said. "I do." She nodded once, then after a pause, "You ever think about going back?" He looked out at the woods. "I did once." But there wasn't anything left to go back to. Naomi was quiet, thinking of the house lost to debts, the garden her mother had planted every spring, the rough timber fence her father built by hand. All of it gone. She didn't ask what Callum had lost. She didn't have to. She turned to face him. "You said you were trying to put something right. What was it?" He didn't answer immediately. The wind moved through the trees, soft and low. "Before the war," he said, "I ran cattle for a man who cut corners and didn't care who paid the price. I looked the other way too long. One night, a fire took half a family's land. They blamed raiders, but I knew better." Naomi's chest tightened. "What did you do?" "I left," he said. "Tried to make different choices, but it doesn't change what I let happen." She stood and stepped closer, her voice steady. "You're not doing that now." "No," he said. "Not this time." The porch boards creaked under her feet. She looked up at him, her face open in a way it hadn't been since they met. "I don't know where I'm going yet," she said. "But I don't want to figure it out alone." Callum didn't move, but something in his gaze softened. "Then don't." She reached for his hand. He let her take it. That night, Ellis offered her the cot inside and Callum the hayloft. In the dark, Naomi lay awake, eyes on the low ceiling, the scent of beeswax still lingering in the air. She thought of the way Callum had touched her shoulder when he passed her the cup, the way he waited for her to speak before he said anything of his own. She had not expected gentleness to feel so solid. Outside, the wind shifted, cooler now. She closed her eyes and let it carry her, not into forgetfulness, but into rest. She had nothing to run from anymore, and in the morning she would have someone to ride beside. 3 days passed at the edge of the ridge, each one drawing a little more ease into Naomi's shoulders. She helped Ellis with the bays in the early morning when the air was still cool and the hives steady with hum. He showed her how to test the weight of a frame, how to watch the queen's line, and how to scrape the wax without crushing the comb. Her hands learned the rhythm quickly. Callum spent his hours clearing brush from the pasture behind the barn. In the evenings, he brought in wood and sat on the porch with a tin cup between his palms, quiet but not withdrawn. Naomi had begun to recognize the way his silence listened, not out of caution but care. On the 4th morning, Ellis handed Naomi a folded paper and said, "Came down from a freight driver yesterday. Thought it might matter to you." Her name was written across the front in a hard, slanted script. She unfolded it slowly, eyes scanning the few lines. Her fingers tightened around the paper. Callum stepped out from the barn, wiping his hands on a rag. "Something wrong?" She looked up, eyes unreadable. "There's a land broker in Cheyenne. Says he bought a parcel from a lender who swore it had no claim, but it's my father's signature. Or something made to look like it." Callum walked closer. "You're sure?" "I know his hand. This one's too clean. He never wrote like that." Ellis leaned against the doorframe. "Cheyenne's near a week's ride." Naomi folded the paper and tucked it inside her skirt pocket. "I need to see it for myself." Callum nodded. "Then I'll ride with you." She met his eyes. "You don't have to. I know." They left the next day at dawn, Ellis handing them a pouch of dried apples and a quiet nod. The air held the scent of coming rain, but the sky stayed clear as they rode east through low hills and open prairie. Naomi rode with a straight spine, jaw set, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Callum didn't question her silence. He rode beside her, steady as the land they crossed. That evening they made camp near a dry riverbed. Naomi gathered kindling while Callum dug a shallow pit for the fire. When the flames caught, she sat across from him, her face drawn in thought. "I always thought I'd leave that land by choice," she said. "Not by losing it." Callum's eyes didn't leave hers. "You didn't lose it. It was taken." She stirred the embers with a stick. "I kept thinking if I worked hard enough it would come back to me. The land, the house, my father's name. But it's not the same, is it?" He shook his head once. "It never is, but it can still be yours." She looked up. "How? You stand there and tell them whose it is, and I'll be standing right behind you." The fire reflected in her eyes, softening the sharpness in her face. "You don't even know what you're walking into." "I don't need to," he said. "I know you." She didn't speak, but her hand reached across the fire, palm up. He took it. They arrived in Cheyenne 5 days later, the town busier than Naomi remembered, with wagons crowding the road and the air thick with the smell of dust and iron. The land broker's office sat above a saloon, paint peeling from the window trim. Naomi stepped inside first. Callum followed without a word, his presence quiet but solid behind her. The broker was lean, with a thick mustache and ink-stained fingers. He looked up from a ledger. "Help you?" Naomi laid the letter on the desk. "You sent this." He picked it up, squinted. "You'd be Ralston then. That land wasn't yours to buy." He flipped through a drawer and pulled out a deed. "Signature matches the one on file." Naomi leaned forward. "My father was already dead when that date was written." The broker's fingers paused. Callum stepped closer. "You want to be real careful about what you say next." The man licked his lips. "Look, I bought it in good faith. If the deed's false, that's for the judge to say." Naomi's voice didn't rise. "Then we'll go see him." The next 3 days were spent at the county records office, sorting through dusty ledgers and sworn affidavits. Naomi found the original deed, signed 2 years earlier in a different hand entirely. The clerk, a tired man with sunburned cheeks, confirmed that no legal transfer had ever been filed. The judge ruled in her favor. Outside the courthouse, Naomi stood on the steps, the deed folded in her hand, the seal still warm from the press. She looked up at Callum, her voice low. "It's mine again." He didn't smile, he just nodded. "It always was." She reached for his arm, fingers curling just above his wrist. "You didn't have to stay through all this." "I know," he said. "But I wanted to." They stayed in Cheyenne 2 more nights. The second evening, Naomi stood by the window of their room at the boarding house, watching the lamps flicker in the street below. She turned as Callum stepped in from outside, brushing dust from his coat. "I've been thinking," she said. He hung his hat on the peg. I don't want to go back to that land alone." He crossed the room, stopping just in front of her. "You won't have to." "I want you there," she said. "Not just for the ride. For whatever comes after." Callum reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Then that's where I'll be." She rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. They stood like that for a long while, the lamps burning low behind them, the streets quieting, and the future settling into something solid and shared. The wagon creaked beneath them as they crossed the final ridge. Naomi sat beside Callum on the buckboard seat, her shawl tied firm against the wind. The deed was tucked inside a leather folio beneath the bench, nestled beside a wrapped loaf of bread, and a jar of dried lavender Ellis had handed her before they left Cheyenne. The scent drifted faintly upward each time the wagon jolted. They had traveled slow, mindful of the early autumn rains that softened the trail and filled the low ditches with water. Naomi had watched the land change, with each passing day scrub fading into grassland, and grassland folding into the familiar contours of home. She hadn't said much since they passed the last stage stop. Her eyes stayed forward, fixed on a place just ahead, a place she hadn't seen since the day she'd left with nothing but a bundle and a promise she hadn't expected to keep. "There," she said, voice steady. Callum pulled back on the reins. The team slowed to a halt. The house had fallen in. One wall still stood, leaning while the roof had collapsed inward like a broken wing. The fence was mostly gone, the gate hanging by one hinge, but the well still stood, and the cottonwood behind it had grown tall. Naomi stepped down from the wagon without a word. Her boots sank slightly into the soft earth. She walked the perimeter slowly, her hands brushing the tops of the dry grass. When she reached the edge of the field, she crouched and pressed her palm to the soil. Callum stayed quiet until she turned back toward him. "You want to rebuild," she nodded once. "I do." He stepped down beside her. "Then we'll start with the foundation." They camped that night beneath the stars, no roof above them but the clear Wyoming sky. Callum laid out the bedrolls close together, and Naomi leaned against his side as the fire burned low. She traced a pattern in the dirt with one finger. "I used to think I had to do everything alone," she said. "That needing someone meant I'd failed." Callum watched the flames. "You didn't fail," she looked up at him. "I know that now." His hand found hers. "You're not alone anymore." They rose with the sun. Over the next days they cleared the ruin of the house, stone by stone, beam by beam. Callum dug post holes while Naomi measured the ground for the new frame. She found her father's old hammer in the remains of the shed, rusted but still solid. She kept it beside her as she worked. When they needed lumber, they rode to a nearby mill, where Callum traded his rifle for a wagon load of sawed planks. Naomi bartered the lavender for oilcloth and nails. The man at the mill offered her a higher price when he saw the deed in her hand, but she shook her head. "I didn't come here to sell," she said. Bit by bit, the house took shape. It was smaller than the old one, but stronger. Naomi built the hearth herself, laying each stone with a mason's eye. Callum carved the lintel beam and set it in place while she held the ladder steady. When the shingles went on, she stood in the field and watched the shadow stretch long across the yard, her arms crossed, the wind lifting the hem of her skirt. In late October, they moved inside. The stove went in first, then the small bed they built together from oak. Naomi stitched curtains from muslin she found in town. Callum hung a lantern from a hook above the table. The light inside was soft, golden, and warm. That night, after the last nail was driven and the last box unpacked, Naomi stood barefoot on the wooden floor and looked around the room. Her eyes lingered on the window, then the fire, then Callum. "It's ours now," she said. He stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "It always was." She leaned back into him, her voice low. "You stayed. I never planned to leave." She turned in his arms, her hands resting on his chest. "I love you." His reply was quiet, sure. "I've loved you since the night you wouldn't let go of my hand." She smiled, a real one, slow and full. "Then don't let go now." "I won't." They kissed by the fire, slow and certain, no rush in it, just the kind of knowing that came from days worked side by side and nights spent in quiet understanding. It was not a beginning shaped by chance or need, but by choice deliberate and deep. Winter came early that year, but the house held firm. The wind howled through the eaves some nights, but the fire never died. Naomi kept bees in the spring, their hives thriving near the cottonwood. Callum took up a bit of smithing, his forge set near the shed. They planted potatoes and beans, and Naomi strung a line of wildflowers along the edge of the porch. They never spoke of the past, unless it was to share what had been learned from it. There was no bitterness between them, only the quiet satisfaction of having come through the long dark and found each other waiting on the other side. On their first anniversary, Naomi placed a stone at the edge of the field, carved with her father's initials. She didn't cry. She just stood with her hand in Callum's and let the wind carry what needed to be carried. They grew older there, together. And at night, with the lantern low and the fire warm, Naomi would rest her head on Callum's shoulder, knowing clearly, entirely, that this peace had been earned. And that it would last.